Hello, friends. Welcome to this session. So, this is our inaugural session on the subject of Indian history. Indian history forms an integral part for our civil services examination as well as Kerala Administrative Service examinations and other competitive examinations. We all know. And in that area itself, our national movement and freedom struggle are the two important areas we have to consider, because a civil servant should be aware of this national movement, how the concept of nationalism or nationhood came into existence, how we consider India as a nation where we people consider our ambitions, our loyalty, etc., are connected to the concept of a single nation, a particular nation, which involves diverse group of people. So that is the primary concern here. So here we are not going to discuss the historical events during freedom struggle or preceding decades and consider how the things happened in detail in this session. Instead of that, we are thematically following the social reform movements which actually led to the nationalism and national movement among people, and that led to the freedom struggle and finally the coming into existence of India as a nation. So that is more important. So such a discussion I am intending in session. We can see this is a thematic discussion. What are the undercurrents led to the change in a drastic change in the Indian society during 19th century and which spilled over to the 20th century and which gave rise to our freedom movement? That's our discussion. So there has been a drastic change, or there is a detachment from the, uh, the previous centuries regarding the attitude of people, regarding the ambitions of people. Such a drastic change has happened, even though it happened over a few or a large number of decades. So there was a change in attitude, change in ambitions, change in outlook, and change in how the society is to be organized and what is the role of an individual in the society, etc., has been undergoing change in what you call the social reform movements that change the nature how people approach religion, nature how people approach the culture, nature how the people approach government, etc., etc. That is it. So we are going to discuss that instead of the chronological order or memorizing the events, years, and the going into the details of such historical events. We are considering the theme of social reform movements here and how these social reform movements finally led to our freedom movement. That is the theme of it. Okay, so why we are considering such a discussion? Because when we appear for civil services examination or examinations of that level, we have to consider giving our opinion, our point of view, whether we can logically present the historical events and whether we can uh, threadbare show this the driving forces, driving historical forces, and what is our approach to it. Our approach should be, of course, based on the a concept of Indian nationhood. That, of course, should be there. The welfare of the people and the welfare of the country should be the basis of such a discussion. This is of any discussion that cannot be questioned. That also we should be very careful about that. And regarding the discussion, we can see that social reform movements, there has been many uh, different types of movements, and that is not a monolithic movement as such that we are going to see. So there will be differences of opinion among the reformers itself. That also we have to take into consideration, and we are approaching it in a particular point of view, and that point there can be other points of view also. So we have to be aware of such points of view also. And when a candidate puts the his answer to a question. That's not an answer to a question, actually. They are trying to, what you call, elicit your attitude and aptitude regarding the nationhood. That's actually happening in services examination. So, having that idea is more important, and we are going into such a discussion. Hope you will enjoy such a discussion. Right. So, we can see that never before in India's checkered past there had occurred a social and political transformation of the magnitude that was initiated by the as a result of the impact of the Indian idea. So we can see that the, the rise of the social reform movements and nationalism that resulted from the colonial rule over India, in a sense. Because before that, even though there can be some cultural linkages, bondages, and there can be some idea regarding Bharatvarsha, etc., in ancient literature, there was no nationhood as such. Geographically or politically, what we see as India today was not a unit at that time. Similarly, social life was also almost stagnant for centuries, and the social organization was a sort of stagnant for centuries. And how that was stirred up by the British colonial rulers in a manner, we can say. So we were responding to the colonial rule. So the social reform movements is in a sense is our response of Indian people to the colonial rule and the impact of colonial rule. It had many what you call oppressive nature, and such impacts was there. So we are responding to that, the oppressive nature of it. At the same time, we came across some ideas the Indian people were not aware of previously. That is also important. And they have introduced some modern ideas into India. And that is also, they introduced education, different education that we were not aware of previously. That is also important when we discuss the social reform movements. That is it. So we can see that with the introduction of British, with the introduction of education, there arose a class of Indian people who got educated, who can get education from abroad. Some even went abroad and got education, and they came across, or they had the introduction of idea of equality. So equality as a premise was not our concern previously, because the organization of the society was hierarchical always in India. How to keep that hierarchy intact was the main concern of social organization during centuries, right? So the idea of equality is somewhat a new idea. There can be rudiments of such idea in ancient India, but that somehow got lost, and we had a hierarchical nature of the society, and to that society get an idea of what you call equality of people, equality of individuals. That is another one of the important things, and that is based upon the conception of individual as repository of values and rights. So far, the role of a man, whether he belongs to the ruling class, or whether he belongs to the elite class or a lower strata of the society, wherever in the caste ladder, his role was more or less defined by social sect to which he belongs. So dharma in that period means his social dharma or dharma as member of the sect. So that was well defined, and whether he is following that definitions, their notions was more important than individual initiative or individual value, etc. That is it. So bringing the individual or the person to the front is an idea which was aligned to our nation previously. That came from the British people, or we can say from the Western ideas, French Revolution, and of course the democratic movement in our colonial rulers, the country of our colonial rulers itself, right? There is a dichotomy. They were oppressing us, and at the same time, they have these liberal ideas, and we came across that liberal ideas as well. A section of the society came across these liberal ideas. That is it. For the first time, a doctrine of social progress. Up to then, that was not an idea of social progress as such in India. Whether we are following the stratification, whether we are following the hierarchy, was more important for Indian society. So your dharma, your jadi dharma, or varna dharma, varnasrama dharma, whether it was kept intact was more important than what you call a social progress, where you can climb up the social ladder. Such an idea was not there, and that such an idea came across. The belief that man can himself through collective action change the structure of society. That is another thing. People can organize and through collective action change the structure of the society. Changing the structure of society was not our previous concern, but keeping that society intact was our concern. So we can consider that social reform movement in a broad perspective as Hindu India's intellectual response to the West. So cannot say that the Hindu India or whatever we define here, people started blindly following the British. Not like that. It was a response. It was a mixed response. Some aspect we may have taken, some ideas we may have taken from the British, but at the same time, the Indian movement consider revival of some ideals in India itself. How revive the vibrancy of our society was also a concern that we will see later. We can see that the interaction of social, religious, and political forces and the gradual weaving of the complex motive of Indian nationalism. That is what I call the national movement. So this interaction, we can see that during the medieval period, we have the Mughal rulers, the what we call the Muslim kingdoms happening in India. But that didn't drastically change our society. Maybe true that a section of people opted for the religion of the rulers, right? Then there may be some sort of discrimination during some rulers' period, but largely the Indian society, the hierarchical Indian society, was they went along with the rulers of other religion as well, because we can see that the ministers etc. came from the upper strata of the society of the Hindu religion itself. We cannot say Hindu religion, the Indian people itself, belonging to the Indian different sects of Indian people, upper strata of the Indian society, cooperated with this rule. That we can see that. Maybe there are conflicts between the kingdoms, etc., etc. That's there, but the society, the social structure was not largely disturbed. That we have to see. The social structure remained almost the same, except that the rulers has a particular religion, and a number of people may have converted to that religion, maybe because of force, maybe because of inducement. That is another question. And we can see that the national social reform movements in India did not ordinarily mean, as it did in the West, a reorganization of the entire structure of the society. You can see that the French Revolution or the democratic changes in England or in other European countries, there was, during the social reform movements, the authority of church over nation was weakened or almost cut off. That was one thing. They were reorganizing the society, and they detached the ruling or the governance from the church. That was one thing that uniformly happened, almost happened in large number of nation states came into existence in Europe. That is one thing. And the changing of the society, structure of the society, from feudal society to what you call a moreover a capitalistic or liberal society establishment. Such an overall of the society is happening in Europe. We cannot consider such an overall in India's case. We can see that it meant in India, it meant the infusion into the existing social structure of newer ways of life and modes of behavior. The sort of infusing some new values, new ways of life. And that has been done by those who came across these ideas. We can say that elite class, that may not be the, the uppermost strata, but the upper middle class who could afford and who came across this Western idea. That we have to consider. Some of the uppermost strata may have turned their face away from these Western ideas. That is another thing. But the upper middle class, we can say, they got the English education, they came across the Western ideas, maybe because they want to have a good position in society, good position in governance, etc. Such tendency happened initially, but they came across these ideas, and their ideas got infused into the society, percolated into the society, and society slowly started to respond to these ideas. That is our social reformation. Generally, such a change was gradual and was initiated only by what we call the upper middle class. You can say that elite class, sometimes say it as filtration theory, the attitude, the aptitude, the ambitions, the way of life of a elite group is imitated or imbibed by the lower strata also. The elite group need not be the richest, but of course they belong to the fortunate class, and they have they are the intellectual allies of that era. So their values, they were vocal, they were articulate, and their values are percolating. That we have to see. You can see that it was only at the beginning of the century, with the growth of organized reform movements, the social basis of Hinduism, the caste system came to be questioned. During the 19th century, the caste system came into question with the organized movements. These organized movements were initiated by people of this so-called the elite class, the educated class. Right to 19th century, movements were aimed to reform, especially in the field of religion. Of course, for 19th century, there were movements. We can consider the Bhakti cult that happened in the previous years. That was in a way a revolt against the orthodox religion in India. But Bhakti cult concentrated on what you call the moksha or mukti of the individual, and that was not a attempt to change the society, but attempt to attain what you call mukti or moksha individually by following what you call the bhakti or devotion to the god. And it was questioning the ritualistic religion, but devotion to god that can be done by any sect of the society, that can be done by those from the weaving class or even the lower class. That was the idea put forward, or ideal put forward by the bhakti movement. So in a way it was questioning the ritualistic orthodox religion, but that was not for altogetherly changing the society, right? That we have to take into consideration. So for changing the society, organizing the people came into existence only during the social reform movements in 19th century. Of course, it is conceived under the influence of Western methods of organization. Such a societal organization was not in our agenda or in our dreams before 19th century. Methods of organization, propagating and recruiting support mainly from English education. Initially, support mainly came from English education. Maintaining at its premises Western concept of individualism, right? The individual's rights, ambitions, dreams, etc., are to be given importance. Its drive is given to be importance. Then only the society can be led forward, right? If he is playing what you call nut and bolt in the society, where is set society, then there will be no marching up forward. There will be no social progress. So we have to take into consideration, have to give prominence to the individual, the personality, right? That is it. The principal motivating force was sober nationalism and positive social ethics, right? The uniqueness lay in the inspiration, the ideas, and the motivation of reformers themselves. That we have to see. So, in Europe, that may have, of course, the role of the intellectuals were there, but the underprivileged started questioning the the privileged class there. So there was an overwhelming thirst for overhauling the society, the changing the society. But India, that thirst has to be infused. So it depends on the ideas of the and motivations of the reformers themselves. So it depended on the reformers more than that happened in other countries like uh, that happened in West. Also, the role of the individuals are important, but there was a social force for forming such thing already there. That we have to consider here. Here, the society has to be stirred up. There, the individuals came up in a stirred up society. Here, the individuals came and they stirred up this, started stirring up the society. That is the difference. Earlier reformers were prompted by the love for underdog, of course. So when they came across the idea of equality, equal treatment to man, equal treatment to man and women, equal treatment to different caste groups, etc., they came across such ideas. Men are equal, all men are equal. Such ideas they came across, and they have some sort of empathy for the underdogs. These modern reformers saw the incompatibility of particular practices with the total progress of society. They observed that certain practices followed by the Indian society, then the caste-ridden Indian society, the hierarchical Indian society, the ritualistic Indian society, are hindrances to the total progress of the society. So they understood this. How they understood it? Because now they came across different ideas, and they, of course, came across different organization of society. They came to know about such things, different types of organization of society, different from what is happening. So that is more important. Then there was an attempt to rationalize the Hindu religion. So they were not rejecting, these reformers were simply rejecting their religion and trying to imitate the Westerners. It was not like that. They were aware of the oppression by the Westerners or the colonialists very well. And but they try to rationalize their own religion, their own culture. The reformers sought to distinguish essential aspect of Hinduism, their own culture, from non-essential ones. So, what are the rituals? What are the evil practices that has according to their view, that doesn't form the essential part of their culture or religion, and that was non-essential part, and that has to be separated from the essential part, the essence of their own culture. That was a cherishable culture. That was their idea. Essentials of Indian culture and their own religious practices, in essence, they are cherishable, but there is a huge mass of non-essential thing, ritualistic thing, or which evil practices, which has to be separated. That was the idea, to separate pristine religion from the subsequent aggressions. That was also a school of thought regarding social reformation. The pristine religion was there in ancient period, or in a what you call a pure golden age, where what happened, subsequent accretions happened, large number of corruption and malpractices and evil practices came into the religion and our culture. So we have to remove that shop and go back to the pristine, pristine religion or pristine culture. So such a way of thinking was also there regarding social reform movements. It was not monolithic. Different types of ideas were there. So interacting constituted, you can see that religious reform and political movement, they are connected, they are interacting, but constituted separate, clearly distinguishable traditions. That we have to see. Our religious or social transformation and political movement were not one and the same. They were separate movements, but they were interacting. They were giving and taking and giving each other, and one nourishing the other. That happened. We can see that the social reform movements nourished the political movement, and some political initiatives induced the social changes. That we can see, but they are distinguishable. And we are together to lay intellectual foundations and emergence of our nationalism. The first stage was marked by efforts on the part of individuals to order their personal life in accordance with the standards adopted from the West. The usual thing happening in every society, testing our standards of life in accordance with the ruling people. That tendency is there. Very rare in every society that can happen. When people from the lower strata get some education and their ambitions go higher, such a desire, such a want will be created among those people. That happened. To organize their lives in accordance with the standards, not according to everything of the cultural notions of the West, but according to certain Western standards. That is the first phase of our social reform movement, actually. And the proponent of this phase, of course, what we call the father of Indian Reformation, Indian social reform movements, Rajaram Mohan Roy. Then we have the onset of second stage by the formation of what we call subnational. National groups means the linguistic identity came into fore, right? Communication through that what we call the vernacular or the regional languages. Now we call regional languages, and taking these vernacular or regional languages for communication the, to the common people came into being. The growth of new desire for unity between scattered, culturally diverse social groups, right? That happened in each organizing in the name of a regional culture or a language. People get having a oneness, feeling of oneness, the name of some cultural linkages and language. That is what we call subnational. It has different languages, large number of languages that we know, right? First glimmer of nationalism appeared on the subcontinent. Two stages came into formation of a national movement or a thinking of a nationalism. Nationalism means feeling of oneness, feeling of belonging to something, feeling of feeling of a narration that we are bonded together. Our destiny is together. A thing happened to arise, and that rose as a response to the colonial rule that we have. the turn of the century, turn of the 19th century, social reform came to mean regeneration of tradition of spirit of nation. That I have discussed just now. Spirit of oneness. The people, the destiny of the people fit together, sense of belonging, sense of loyalty, sense of elegance to a concept. It is a narration actually. Nationhood, nationalism is a sort of myth or what a narration happening there. And there are many things which lead to such a narration where people share, right? That may be a geographical unit, that may be some cultural practices, that may be a language which unite people together, that may be a religion which unite people together. India, all these things were diverse. We can see that. Still, a narration of a nation came into existence. There are, of course, some cultural, some mythological ideas we share all through India. All through India, as India we see now, there are certain things. But premises which we see Western nations was not present here. A regeneration founded on religious revival and cultural xenophobia. That also happened. A religion, reviving our religion, culture, reviving our culture. That was also a response. How people respond. That was a that was a river or some sort of a stream of our national reform movement already. Then cultural xenophobia. That means we are a culture, then we have some reservations or some about some apprehensions about the aligned culture, and they are going to implement that aligned culture on our own people. That became a concern. That's what we call xenophobia. That a xenophobic trend was there in nationalism that happens. Yeah, also that there was a strand like that also. It came to Rajaram Mohan Roy, he is considered as father of Indian Reformation, maker of modern India, sometimes he is called. He lived from 1772 to 1827. 1827, 1833. Rajaram Mohan Roy was an exemplary case, a different human being who was ahead of his times, combining deep erudition. He was a scholar in Indian tradition as well as in uncommon wisdom, right? Roy tried to synthesize the age-old Hindu values with the rational elements of the Western ideas, Christian as well as Islamic traditions. They didn't copy this Christian or Islamic tradition as such, but there are some aspects of this Christian and Islamic traditions took. Even now, the organization of the religious movements, Hindu religious movements, our national attitudes, we can see that certain aspects, certain elements of this Christian and Islamic traditions are there. So we try to synthesize the rational elements from there and combine this with our own values. Roy founded, we know, Brahmo Samaj was a monotheistic religious society. Roy and followers of Brahmo Samaj believed in a single God. So that has many significance. Say that India also there is an idea of what you call Brahma, Parabrahma, etc., where we consider the wholeness or oneness of God. Of course, but that was not emphasized in it. We have Vaishnavites, we have Shaivites, etc., and different sects here. Number of different gods, etc. On what we call the polytheistic religion mission. But the idea of monotheism have got from Christian and Islamic traditions, but he emphasized it with Hindu beliefs, right? That's why he used the word Brahma Samaj. Stands for the Parabrahma, one God, and it also had some more significance. When you subject to the belief of one God, what happens? Every human beings become brothers and sisters in a way, because all are creations of the single God. That was his idea, right? Atmiya Sabha and Samad Kaumudi. Samad Kaumudi was a sort of journal. Atmiya Sabha was the precursor to the Brahma Samaj. Really, that was later converted. And in Samad Kaumudi, he ardently debated for abolition of certain practices like sati, Kulinism, and, and for the introduction of love marriage. Sati, you all know, it was abolished by legislation during British rule itself, right? Roman Roy was in the forefront for fighting for such an abolition. Then Kulinism was some sort of practice followed, initiated in Bengal actually, and went through the whole where we have to keep the record of the kulas and marriage should follow certain rules. So, suppose in a lineage, eighth generation can marry only from eighth generation. Then what happens? We can see that sometimes in eighth generation you have a kid that doesn't get a spouse of similar age that generation. So he or she cannot marry from a different generation. You have to keep the record of the kula. Similarly, we have what we call anuloma and prediloma marriages, where is allowed under some cases. Upper caste man can marry a lower caste, but the reverse is completely prevented because it will mix up the varnasama dharma. That was the argument, and lot of other evil practices were followed by what we call the Kulinism and Kuladharma, and Roy fought against that, and he fought for widow remarriage. You can see that large number of young widows, because young girls were married to aged men. That was a constant practice there, and their husbands die. They have to be a widow throughout the life. All their human rights will be cut off, and they cannot come into any occasion. They cannot come outside either, or they have to shave off their head. They cannot use a good cloth, etc. Large number of rules were there, or the practice of sati was there. That was it. Roy fought against these evil practices. That was his primary concern, and he argued for that and constantly campaigned for. So he began rationalizing Hindu tradition and clearing the underbrush of social. Wanted to do away with these social levels and rationalize Hindu tradition and uplift the Hindu traditions and Hindu customs, Hindu way of life. That he wanted. He didn't want to avoid or move away from Hinduism. Wanted to reform Hinduism so that it suits the modern age. That was Roy's idea. Roy's idea was further put forward by Chandra Vidyasagar in Bengal itself, that at the very core of orthodoxy by his monumental crusade for widow remarriage. Chandra Vidyasagar was forefront. You can see that the social reform movements caught fire in other areas of India, Bombay, Madras, and other regions. Vishnu Shastri Pandit, that is an important name, fought governmental sanction for the same. Right? He called for the governmental interference. The British governmental interference to change these customs. In Madras, Veerasalingam Pandulu, he formed a movement, Rajamundry Social Reform Association, which campaigned for such things, widow remarriage and other. You can see that different patterns of this social reform movement, Western India, as against the dramatic unconventionality of Bengali reformers in Bombay, there was no complete break from traditional society. A piecemeal approach was followed there. Rather, what was sought was a practical adjustment of religious conviction and social behavior towards a more open, egalitarian basis. A slower sort of change, a small type of governmental intervention, and convincing the society and changing, slowly changing. That was aimed initial Western reformers. Later on, we have another strand that we will discuss later. I already said that there were different patterns. Another pattern was put forward or initiated by Dayananda Saraswati. Right? His argument and his ideology and his tradition was different from the tradition which started by Dayananda Saraswati is different from that started by that initiated by Rajaram Mohan Roy. Totally different was impact of Swami Dayanand and the early Arya Samaj on northern India. Combined in himself several paradoxical elements that there were we cannot understand how he um, combined together differing ideas and formed a strong movement. That is such a wonderful act, in a sense. He was extremely conservative in his thought and belief, some sense, sometimes to the point of obscurantism. Right? It was not very clear whether he's conservative or whether he is pro change or something like that. That is what we call obscurantism. Actually, he had a conservative mind regarding religion and culture. Yet he was astonishingly revolutionary in his attitudes and actions. His attitudes and actions, he was a revolutionary because he considered organizing people, organizing religion in a different manner, a manner which was not seen in Indian history so far. Complex reaction to the Western influence. Swami Dayananda Saraswati. Rejecting existing caste-based society, was against caste-based society. Inferior status of women and the system of child marriages. Was against such practices. He called for vigorous program for social reform, aimed not so much at westernizing the Hindu religion as in reviving the glory of Vedic religion. He considered that the ritualistic Hindu religion, some sort of the what you call corruption happened into our own religion. We remove that shop and we go back to the pristine religion, the purity of the religion during Vedic ages. That was it. Vedic ages were had its own rituals and traditions. That's another thing. But you want to avoid certain social practices and go back to what you call the Vedic religion. There were what you call the this what you call paradoxical elements is in his point of view, right? And we have to see that all the religious traditions so far were social. The practices considered the social playing the social role. Why he should play a social role? You have to play the social role. Your Jadi Dharma or Varnasrama Dharma, you have to play because then only you can consider attaining salvation. That was it. The personal salvation was the ultimate aim, right? Salvation, getting mukti or moksha from the rebirth cycle. That was the basic idea, right? Getting mukti from the Maya. That was the basic idea of Indian philosophy at that time. But Swami Dayananda Saraswati changed the aim of personal salvation to salvation of society. So that is an important book. He considered changing the society by means of individual self-assertion and amelioration of social evils. So this social salvation can be attained by individual self-assertion. Those are who are enlightened, those who have the knowledge of the pristine Indian religion or pristine Indian traditions. So what we get, what results from this is that we have a chosen set of people, and their actions has to give salvation to society. Their organization, they have to organize the society. So that is a main point we have to consider regarding Swami Dayananda Saraswati. We can call it as militant spiritualism. The emergence and development of extremist nationalism in India. We can go to the roots. If you go to the roots of extremist nationalism in India, see that Swami Dayananda Saraswati's ideas. So the sprouts of different sprouts of extremist nationalism can go to the roots. When you go to the roots, you can see the name or the ideas of Dayananda Saraswati there. Bringing the dynamism of the past to vivify the modern mold. That was it. Considered the past was dynamic, past was golden, past was something to be cherished, and how to bring back that dynamism. Right? His own deep rooted xenophobia was carried on to the subsequent generation. So the cultural xenophobia that was carried, that was propagated and carried to the subsequent generation, and served to inspire the militant anti-British temper of extremist politics at the turn of the century. We can see that a large number of extremist movements in Bengal, in Punjab, different areas of India sprouted up, and their ideas we can see that their ideas they borrow from Dayananda Saraswati small to large extent. See, of course, the extremist movement, a small sector of the extremist movement has ideas from socialism or what you call the the formation of communism. That doesn't, communism as such doesn't came into India, but they have there is a socialist strata also in the case of this extremist movement. That also we have to take into consideration. But largely, this extremist movement were inspired by Swami Dayananda Saraswati's ideas, not person as such, but his ideas. That is it. Connected to this was Dayananda's idea that history could be interpreted in order to justify social action. That is it. History has to be interpreted. History is not a dry discussion of facts, according to Dayananda. Dry description of facts, dry description of events, but it is a living thing. We have to interpret according to the need of the hour. That is it. So, from a point of view, we have to approach history. So, here comes all the. We can see that any historical writing, there will be a point of view, there will be a thread, there will be a theme, and that theme or ideology will depend on the writer as well as his personal and social interest. That is there. But being modern historical method stands for being an objectivity also, bringing up objectivity also. But here, that is not much important. Objectivity is not much important in regarding the Dayananda Saraswati's ideas. That is, this is used, history is used to arouse people's feelings for the past glory of the nation. That was important for him. So that people can be organized. That we have to see. And that type of usage of history we are seeing today itself, today also. Throughout the history, we can see that. Interpreting history to suit the interest of particular group or particular class of interest, that we can see anywhere world. But that becoming the main ideology, that you can see that the seed of that ideology, Dayananda Saraswati, as regarding India's history. This attitude was closely followed by Tilak in his interpretation of Gita and Savarkar in his interpretation of Indian War of Independence. In War of Independence is the first freedom struggle, we say, 1857. He has interpreted it in a particular manner. And he gave the name Indian War of Independence for the first freedom struggle, we say. Right? So there this theme we can see. How to look to the history to arouse passions, arouse bondages, arouse sometimes xenophobic sectorial emotions. That we can. And xenophobia was directed against British initially, but later on, this Savarkar's ideas were developed, where xenophobic fear was directed towards internal groups as well. That we can. I'm not delving into the details now. Okay. Now we can come to genesis of nationalism. 1870s, a new stage, new set of group loyalties began to seep over the various sections of the educated populace. Right? Educated people, a new set of what you call the loyalty to a idea of a nation, a nationhood started developing among the educated people who were working with the government positions. Are the number of people who are working with government positions, both in British government as well as what you call the local kingdoms. They were in positions. Some people were in positions. They also started the feeling of loyalty, a different loyalty to an Indian nation. Started slowly developing. Maybe equal treatment of a British servant and Indian servant, maybe their motto. Equal berths and other things, maybe their motto is to start with. Giving higher positions to Indian people, maybe their demand initially, but that developed into what you call loyalty away from the British government, which is away from the kingdoms, fiefdoms, but to another idea of a different nation, even though the idea was not fully developed then. It was the first glimmer of national consciousness began to appear on the Indian intellectual horizon towards the end of the 19th. Then only the nationalism, genesis of nationalism, came into being. So that we cannot say that there was a nationalism as such. Was idea of nationalism came into being during that period, where the social reform movements, as after the social reform movements have taken their roots. Different plans and different type of thinking regarding social reforms aroused feelings among, especially among educated people. Subcontinent had a few, if any, of the preconditions which bring a single nation in. That we have. Indian subcontinent. The picture of the Indian subcontinent was entirely different from what we see today. This is only a British India map. Even it was divided more than that. There were large number of what you call the smaller kingdoms there under the British overall British fiefdom, right? Then directly run British provinces, and it included areas of other countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, areas of Pakistan, Afghanistan, and what you say, Myanmar, etc. Were British India at that time, in a sense, and they were so diverse, different types of governments. There was not political unity as such. You can see that only an overall colonial what you call hegemony of the British was there. we can say that. Apart from that, there was no political unity, geographically different areas, climate-wise different areas, language, different languages, different dialects, different types of food habits, different types of clothing habits, and different stages of development the people were, hierarchically different strata in which the people were. That we can see. And here, these are all not premises or preconditions for developing a nation. Still, a nationhood, feeling of nationhood developed in it. That is a what you call a new experiment in a sense. Of course, there are certain mythical traditions which were uh, in a sense followed by or people were aware of. That is true. But that also you can see that the the Sanskrit literature, you have what you call the vernacular language versions only. We're aware of Ramayana, a vernacular version of Ramayana that is different from the what you call the Valmiki Ramayana or something, right? And Kerala people followed Hindu religion, but the customs practices of what you call the Brahmin class in Kerala will be entirely different from the practices in Varanasi or Kashmir. That was it. And there, this nationhood, feeling of nation, rose. That we have to see. So a narration was forward. That was a reaction to the British, and we have took certain Western ideas regarding nationalism, and we were knitting together from this diverse group of people an ambition for a better life, a better or what we call a larger pride, a national pride that was being generated. What developed as Indian nationalism was actually a myth or narration based on consciously propagated ideas, and one which was more a product of personal preferences of the so-called nationalists than an enunciation of social reality. Social realities were diverse, but the preferences, the ideas of what we call the nationalists, those who advocated Indian nationhood, was more important, right? They were trying to form a narration of, and it borrowed from our own traditions, our own culture, took some common threads of our own culture and tried to integrate it with Western ideas of nationhood, of democracy, of freedom, of equality, etc. That's what they tried to do. That was also not monolithic. There were different strata, strands, or different streams for this movement. An attempt was made to relate this myth to shared religious, linguistic, and geographic identification. So this myth or narration of the nationhood, was to be linked to the shared religious, linguistic, and geographic identification. Right. Nationalism India was consciously and carefully contrived by an eminent company of intellectuals. All the intellectuals were subjecting to the same idea. They had slightly differing and sometimes vastly differing ideas regarding nationhood. So, two aspects. We can call it culturalism and localism. Culturalism, that is what we can see as shared by different groups of people. And we look into the culture of people, cultural practices of the people follow. When you look into the cultural practices, the localism comes into play. That is, culturalism try to unite, but at the same time, their diverse nature also come into play, because culture is local in some sense. As they try to infuse a pan-Indian cultural values and ethos, but at the same time, culture was local. Culture is local. Nationalism is an artificially inducible stimulation You can see that resulting from consciously propagated ideas. This requires the manipulation of certain deep-rooted social symbols, right? So nationalism has to be propagated as an idea, can be propagated as a purely, cannot be propagated as a purely rationalistic idea based on Western ideas of equality, fraternity, etc. Not be done like that, but we have to arouse certain deep-rooted social symbols. How to use that? These social reformers and national movement leaders knew that, and they tried to use these deep-rooted social symbols. That is again what you call a paradox or dichotomy, but that is the only way a nation can be organized. Nationalism thus becomes a matter primarily of social communication. There, there come into play what you call culturalism versus localism, culturalism and localism, or versus localism. Okay, now we come to Indian National Congress. Early Congress idea of nationalism was elitist and gradualistic in conception. It was formed by an elitist group, and we also knew that actually a British servant also was involved in the formation of this Indian Association and then Indian National Congress, right? And they were actually campaigning for equal treatment of Indian as well as the British people in the government service. That was initially their demand. Then they demanded for the welfare of the people. So it was a gradualistic conception, right? Elite, it was a movement among the elites, educated elites only during the initial period. It didn't percolate into the masses initially. Broadly, it was based on the theory of filtration of ideas from the top to the lower. That they were looking for. Filtrate the ideas, to propagate the ideas slowly into the society, goes into the lower strata of the society, and at the same time work for the welfare of the lower strata. That was their basic idea. Initially aimed for mass education, right? How this mass can be aroused by education, giving education to the masses was concern of Indian National Congress initially. Economic advancement, some social reforms, not very drastic reforms as advocated by some social reformers, and a unity of a kind that Western nations enjoyed. They were emulating, trying to emulate a unity that we see in Western nations at that period. That they were trying to emulate here, emulate that among a diverse class of people. That was it. So early International Congress based their ideology on anti-traditional, liberal democratic, secular and politically oriented concept of the nation, right? That they were taking as the basic idea regarding the nation. Anti-traditional, that means the hierarchical organization of the nation. They are not subject to kingdoms. They do not advocate. They are advocating instead of that liberal democratic, secular in a way, keeping away religion. Religious sphere should be a different thing compared to the political sphere. That was the initial idea, and politically oriented concept. Properly encompass all Indian cultures, so that it was done in such a manner so that it can encompass all Indian cultures. So the political sphere has to encompass all the people together. So it cannot identify with a particular cultural or particular group. That was the basic theology of Indian National Congress, right? Conceptually, Congress had a clear notion of nationalism. The precise strategy for mobilization of popular support was not certainly worked out by early Congress nationalists. They tried for social welfare actually, and tried for education, spreading education. That they were their demands. Establishing schools, colleges, etc., were some of their demands, and also giving equal treatment to Indian servants. Their demands were just like that, and involvement in the governance. More representation for the Indian people in the governance. That were the demand. So Congress ideology was initially like that. Then we have the other stand, what we call parochial nationalism, another distinct effort at stimulating nationalism. Rajnarayan Bose, Nabagopal Mitra, etc., are certain names which we can identify. Their idea was that Hindus are destined to become a religious nation. That was put. Religion as the basis of, or what they call the cultural basis of a nation. Religion. So, we can see that Western world also, religion is one of the components which unite the people together in a nation. So that was taken here too, and it was put forward that Hindus and their culture form a, that was the basic idea. From that came the other idea, Muslims forms another nation. Okay, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee advocated such an idea of nationhood based on the traditional culture and religion. You can see that. Social solidarity could be achieved primarily by stirring religious and cultural loyalties. That was Bankim Chandra's ideas, by working out a close identification of individual with a particular community. So this is bringing back some sort of, not the sort of varnasamal dharma we already seen, instead of that, a religion which unite different varnasramas, or religious allegiance is the foremost thing to decide nationhood. Right. Amounted to the basis of nationalism was religious revivalism. So reviving the religious religion, which has the religion was subdued and it has to be revived. That was their idea. Religious practices has to be brought back to a ferment. That was it. No longer was nationalism viewed as a theoretical concept as by the moderates of the Indian National Congress. It became a vibrant collective consciousness. When only such what you call archetypes, belief, mythological figures were aroused, it became a collective consciousness. Another important noticeable feature was the stress on the vernacular that we have to see. These people stressed on vernacular or regional languages as the vehicle of nationalism, because the national identity has to be encompassing the masses. If you want to encompass the masses in the idea of nationhood, what we have to do, we have to communicate with them. That communication can be done only in regional languages, not in English. So that's an important difference to be noted. The relevance of extremist moderate conflation. There was some conflict between extremist, what you call the extremist ideas, and moderate ideas. The debate over age of consent bill. Social reform movements, the age of consent or child abolition of child marriage was one of the agenda of social reform movements. Moderate reformers like Malabari, Kidumal, they were proponents of the such idea. But there was opposition. Garbhadana, that was a practice. Vernacular press viewed this unwarranted inference in religious affairs with suspicion and mistrust. So the extremist, or what you call the cultural nationalism, the strand of cultural nationalism or religious nationalism, we can say, it considered as it has unwarranted interference on the part of the government also, not only on the part of the social reformers, but on the part of the government in religious affairs with suspicion and mistrust. We have to see that this was shared by other religious groups as well. Such a notion or such a emotion was shared by other religious groups, and this type of nationalism was advocated. These two people represent the two extremes, two different main strands of nationalism. Tilak and Ranade. Balgangadhar Tilak and Govind Ranade. For Tilak, Because most important for him was not any particular program or social political reform. A particular program for social or political reform was not his concern. Giving some more representation, a piecemeal type of change in political organization of the government was not his primary concern. But or abolishing a undesirable social practice is not his primary concern, but awakening within the masses of a political and social cause. Awakening the masses based on cultural identity, evocation of religious and cultural loyalties was more important for Tilak. Admittedly, these social evils to be curbed. He admitted that social evils has to be changed or curbed. But to argue in favor of legislation, that was his main argument for social reform, seemed to imply acknowledgement that India's advancement was dependent upon British. Pleading with the British government for changing our social custom means that we depend on British for our social progress. That cannot be admitted. That was his argument. So for him, the social changes was only secondary. A xenophobic arousement of national feelings was more important for Tilak. So that was it. Moderates emphasized on social reform, but extremists advocated whether social reform should precede political reform or vice versa. That was the key of the debate between extremists and moderates. Ranade, he represents the moderate clause. So to give national recognition to the social reform movement, attaching National Social Conference to the Indian National Congress as its counterpart. Within the Indian National Congress, he formed National Social Conference, so that Indian National Congress take up the cause of social reform. That was his idea. The time Muslim League came into work, the formation of Muslim League and theory of two separate streams of cultural consciousness cut at the roots of earlier Congress stand on nationalism. So the extremists were propagating the cultural identity. Muslim League came into being, and the two nation theory came, and that was cutting at the root of earlier Congress stand on the liberal democratic, or what you call all encompassing nationhood idea of. And this extremist ideas we can attribute to three figures, three personalities, that is B.C. Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, and Aurobindo Ghosh. Of course, the triumvirate we say Bal, Pal, Lal, Lala Lajpat Rai. Lala Lajpat Rai's ideas were also has leanings towards the extremist ideas, but his ideas was not in full agreement with the religious cultural identity because he had more exposure to the West. That is another thing. Even though he advocated an extremist type of organization, his ideas were not actually the copy of the other two. So better we group together Bal, Tilak, and Aurobindo. That's my own opinion. Religious nationalism. All the three advocated, and all the three had allegiance to religious nationalism. The incorporation of masses into political movement based on religious fervor. The identification of the nation with the religious ideas. Right? It has to be identified as a Hindu nation. The nationhood should be Hindu nationhood. That idea was shared by these three. Aurobindo. Swaraj was the fulfillment of ancient life of India under modern conditions and the return of Satya Yuga of national greatness. So we can see that Dayananda Saraswati, some ideas are put forward in a more fervor and a more modern type of organization by Aurobindo. See that. Satya Yuga, he considered Satya Yuga an ancient period, and we want to return of that Satya Yuga of national greatness. That was Aurobindo's ideas. Later, he discarded all political movements and went to the French colony, that is now the Puducherry. earlier Pondicherry, established ashram there because of his arrest and other things. Actually, gave up all the extremist activities. The national spirit was to penetrate beneath the English educated intellectual groups, and truly Indian, only a cultural religious awakening could affect this. It was the basic idea. If the national spirit, see what they call the democratic, liberal democratic spirit, etc., that is shared by a few educated, English educated men or a few English educated people. Mass has to be aroused into a nationhood. Be truly Indian, only a cultural religious awakening could affect it. That was the idea behind this same nationalism. Annie Besant also actually is of a cultural nationalist. Actually, after an initial attempt to bolster orthodox position, she was what you call an Indologist, captivated by Indian mythical traditions, came to India, Indian spiritual traditions, came out in her book Wake Up India, a plea for social reform. She advocated social reform, initially moving away from the orthodox position, with a vigorous plea for all major planks of the social reformers program, including remarriage of virgin widows and emancipation of the depressed classes. Right, social reform was also taken up by Annie Besant and her Theosophical Society. Okay, another important name we know, Swami Vivekananda, who aroused the masses, aroused the what you call the spiritual or cultural nationalism. Arise, awake, and do not stop until the goal is reached. That's his motto. Was profoundly struck by the malaise of his own society. Was worried about the malaise or what you call the evil practices or weakness of his own society. Rejected mukti, a spiritual rejuvenation. Indian tradition, we have the what you call the concept of mukti, but he didn't subject to that idea. Put the tire there at the level of masses and let it burn upwards and make Indian nation. Wanted to arouse the people. So the fire has to start from the lower strata. That was his idea. From the masses. Revivalist nationalism, its impact. These are all what you call revivalist nationalism. Okay. Then come Gandhi. I have omitted certain strands. I have said the socialist stream of the extremist movement itself. Similarly, the social reform movements by Jyotiba Phule, as well as Kerala, we have Srinarayana Guru, a tradition, Ayyankali, etc. That was a reform movement different from that initiated by the English educated elite, but that came from the lower strata. That was also there, and that led to finally the Ambedkarite movement that I haven't touched upon, but only the earlier things I have touched upon for the time being. Okay, now we come to Mahatma Gandhi. His greatest uttering, my life is my message. That was message and life are one and the same. Such a claim, no person, no human being can publicly proclaim. The different thing. So Gandhi is fairly different person that we among all the nationalists. A very important sense, Mahatma Gandhi synthesized the two approaches, cultural nationalism and the liberal democratic traditions, or the extremist and moderates ideas. Gandhiji went on to synthesize or combine them in a particular manner, in his own fashion, in his own nature of organization, his own means, right? The moderate and the extreme, and evolved an altogether new response to the British influence. He was influenced by Western thinkers as well. Was influenced by pacifist Western thinkers, Thoreau, Ruskin. There are many other influences, right? Buddha, he was influenced by, but he was influenced by the Indian traditions equally or more than these, these ideas also. His emphasis was not always on reason and empirical evidence, as advocated by our moderate nationalists, but rather on an ethical imperative. What is morally obliging? That was his concern. And can have the Ahmedabad trial, where Gandhi was put under court trial for the untoward incident happened in Mumbai and Madras in response to his non-cooperation movement, or what you call disobeying rules, disobeying law. Time, he said that it is moral obligation to stand for the people. That's why he stand for the people. He pleaded guilty. Maybe even though he advocated ahimsa, non-violence, some of the agitators may have indulged in violence, and he took responsibility for all incidents. But he said that it is his moral obligation fight to stand with the people. That was the sort of conviction Gandhi had. Furthermore, and most effectively, he impressed by the strength of personal example. That was another thing. What he advocate has to be practiced in his personal life. You can see that among social reformers, there may be some divergence when we come to some personal decisions and what they advocate for social reform earlier period. But in the case of Gandhi, whether it is political or social movement, social change he advocate, he tried to practice it initially. Ahimsa, he practiced himself. Satyagraha, he practiced himself. Then only he advocated it to the people. Yet again, he refused to accept moderate stand that true national unity could only be achieved by the complete removal of caste barriers. That we have to see. The traditional organization of the society, altogetherly changing it. Gandhiji didn't advocate, right? This caste system has its own advantages. He sometimes said like that. He was in conflict with Ambedkar regarding that. Position we have to take, that is another question. But he was not for the overall throwing away of the organization of Indian society. He was not for that. While he wielded xenophobic spirit that had been roused by earlier extremists, used the cultural identity roused by the earlier extremists, right? His rejection of violence in politics changed the very strategy of the national extremist movement. People, there are different strands which advocated what you call armed struggle or some sort of fighting, that he completely renounced, and he rejected violence completely. Thus, he combined the moderate and extremist elements, and he produced new weapons. He that does not depend on any violent activity, but a sort of different type of political struggle. Gandhi thus was able to rouse the masses, but he taught them to wield a different weapon. That is important. Appeal to the masses through the conscious use of symbols borrowed from Hindu. He had the concept of Ramaraja. He had the concept of other symbols from Hinduism. Used it. He was prompt to stress its universalism. That he has. His Ramaraja concept was different from the religious nationhood advocated by some others. Ramaraja was all encompassing. He once said that I'm a Hindu, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Christian, like that. So his idea of Ramaraja or his idea of nationhood was entirely different. Even though he was a devout Hindu, his Hinduism, his type of religious practice was all encompassing the way. Was prompt to stress its universalism and prevent the national movement from becoming mere communal congregation. Okay, that we come to a close session to see that religious movement, sorry, the reform movement, social reform movement, form the what we call the roots of our national movement. These streams came together and they formed a river, what we call the national movement. The, the, the nationalism aroused in it, not a, not a single stream, but different streams came together. Nationhood came together as a result of struggle. Now you can enter into the social reform movement and read the social reform chapter. You can read the formation of Indian National Congress chapter. Then we will be having detailed discussions on that, and we will be discussing questions based on that also, with a view to the preliminary civil services examination. But having this theme, whether you subject yourself to a particular stream or not, that's not important. But knowing this theme, having a point of view, more important. So for the time being, see soon with a detailed discussion on this social reform movements and discussing questions on social reform movement. Okay, bye for now. Thank you.